Welcome to Syntax. Today we've got a pretty interesting episode on Rust, on WASM, on 1Password, on all kinds of interesting things. We've got Andrew Burkhart on, who is a senior Rust engineer at 1Password. We've been talking over DMs for a couple months, just kind of, I always like to chit chat with people about like what they're doing at their company and how they're approaching it. And 1Password is a really interesting platform because there's so many different places where 1Password will live. There's so many different applications. There's browser extensions, there's iOS apps, things like that. But then there's also there's cryptography and things need to happen locally, and it needs to work offline. It has to happen. It has to sync data. There's all kinds of really interesting stuff. So I asked him if he would come on and talk to us a little bit about how that all works. So welcome, Andrew. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You want to give us a quick rundown of who you are, what you do, and at 1Password?
Yeah, definitely. So like you said, I'm Andrew. I'm a senior Rust developer at 1Password. I work on, we call it the frameworks team. Naming obviously gets hard with bigger teams, but we work on kind of like the lowest level of our Rust core. So things like the data layer, some of the networking stuff, synchronization, things like that. I've been here about 2 years now, but prior to that, I was doing pretty much all like web backend stuff, like TypeScript, Node, and Kotlin Spring Boot.
Right on. So you want to give us a quick rundown of like how 1Password works? Like I'm sure people obviously people know it's a password manager. You log in, you put your passwords in there, and then it'll autofill it. I think we understand that part, but it's like a local app, and like what happens when you save your password, and let's just use that to sort of frame the discussion we're having today.
Yeah, definitely. So like you said, so we have a couple components, but generally speaking, we have, a cloud piece. We have a Rust core. And then we have sort of like thin clients, you might say, right? Like our iOS app, our Android app, and so forth. And so that kind of helps us so that we can, try and squeeze as much into that Rust core as possible, so that we're obviously not, duplicating code anywhere we don't have to be, and so forth. And then that's kind of nice because you can compile that Rust app and embed it into all these other apps. But it also does present certain challenges, right? Because you're trying to do certain things across different platforms and so forth. And it's also presented challenges, historically, because it's like, how do you run, a web app on something like that and so forth, which is something we're working on now. But then, we have this server component that also acts as sort of that's where we handle all of our sort of data persistence or sync stuff. There's some different things that do have to go through there, like, something we call like trusted device enrollment. So for example, if you have passkey on one device and you want to go, use on another device, you may have to verify that, or something like SSO, sign in on a new device with SSO or something like that. So it's a few things that server side orchestrates, but we try and get as much as we can into that Rust core to make sure that it's, extendable and again, we have kind of maximum reusability of that code.
Okay. Because I'm trying to think about using the 1Password application. Sometimes I use it via the browser extension. Sometimes I use it as the Mac OS desktop app. And often I'll use it on the iOS application. And if I'm creating a new, let's say I'm creating a new login, I type in my email address, I type in the password, or it generates one for me, and I hit save. What's the data flow from me interacting with the input to actually getting to 1Password?
Yeah, so that's luckily that's kind of my specialty here is like the sync stuff. But yeah, so let's say, for example, let's just say like you have your Mac app open and you have your iPhone open, or something like that, right? Yeah. So the way that it works is, on your iPhone, you're interacting with an iOS app, a native Swift app, and then that's going to do whatever inputs there. That's going to send what we call an invocation, which is basically like the mechanic for making requests from the client app to that embedded Rust core. And that's kind of its own little cool bit of Rust that does it kind of has like this loop that sort of just watches and receives from a channel. And, there's some serialization and deserialization that goes on, stuff like that. But anyway, it ends up processing this task asynchronously. That front end app will also pass in a callback. And whenever the core is done processing that, it will execute that callback with the actual data that it's collected as the response. That's the same way you'd get info or create info or anything. But then that core will go through its server client Once it's done storing it locally and everything, we will basically tick a local edit count and say, hey, there's something here that's got a modification, right? And it will start a sync process. And so what happens is it reaches out to an endpoint that we have on the cloud side that goes, hey, we have a change for this, but give me the kind of the state of the world. Give me all the versions of everything for this account. That's going to pull down, here's this list of vaults that you have and all the content versions and things like that. And then it's going to do some local resolution. So it's going to go, all right, there's this other vault that's got some edits that I don't have. So I'm going to pull all this stuff down and then I'll push my stuff up when I'm done. So it's always pull first and then push.
Okay.
That does create, some unique challenges, right? For two reasons. One, because you might have an edit on the cloud to something that I just said, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you got to do some conflict resolution, and that gets tricky because of the, like you mentioned before, like we have a unique problem space, right? Where everything on the server has to be completely encrypted. The server has to be completely dumb to all the contents. So what that means is we can't have the server do conflict resolution at all. It doesn't have any access to that data. It can't see anything that's going on.
Yeah.
All we have is like a content version and, an ID or whatever. And there's a few different versions, right? Like there's a version of, the access list for this, things like that, so that we kind of know who can see what and so forth. But that's the biggest issue we run into with this kind of sync process is the server can't help. It's completely blind to what's going on.
Wow.
So everything has to go to the server and then get pulled down to the device and do conflict resolution on the device before we actually push those changes back up to the server is kind of the new source of truth.
That's wild. So
That's
like,
wild, yeah.
you usually you think, oh yeah, we'll have a single server and that will be our main spot for it. But you have 1Password has no idea about what our passwords are, so it can't compare email addresses or
exactly
usernames. So you have to do it on device. And how do you decide which device to do it on?
So it depends. Technically, they're all doing it to some degree.
Okay.
Because of that, we're a little bit cautious about it in terms of like, there may be a point where it's like, this can't be reconciled. Like you're going to need to like manually figure this out. We want to make sure with the subject matter we're dealing with that data loss is like unacceptable at any point ever, right? You can't afford for that at all. So because of that, we'll never like take a chance on trying to merge something that we don't know can be merged. But there's a few, and this again goes into kind of some neat Rust stuff, but like we essentially have a trait that is like merge strategy. And whenever you save data locally, you have to pass in a trait object that defines the merge strategy for this data. And so, there might be one that's like save wins. And basically that's just like last edit wins. Like whoever edited most recently, gets this. And that might happen in certain scenarios. Or there may be some that are a little more cautious and are like, if there's any kind of like collision that we see here, just like pass it back. It's like, we don't know, It's not like an amazingly complex conflict resolution system, but it is, it's much more of a concurrency or distributed problem than it is the actual, resolution piece.
Wow. That's really interesting. We've been talking a lot about CRDTs and local first stuff on here, and syncing is such a big part of that, and it always feels so daunting. And that's all being done within the Rust component, you said? That's pretty amazing. The one thing I really admire about the 1Password app is that my data is always synced without me ever having to do anything. It's always there, and it's always correct. I never have to worry about it. So whatever you guys are doing, it is fast and it works.
Yeah. I've noticed it getting like faster lately. Like I will sometimes have my kid's iPad open. I have my 1Password on there. Or like I'll try to autofill something on a website and I'll go, oh, it's using the .com version. I'm trying to sign into Amazon.ca. So I'll go into 1Password, I'll add Amazon.ca to allowed domains, and it will pop up immediately. And like, how do you do that so fast? Is it WebSockets or something?
Yeah, so there's actually a few ways, and this is one of the things we're trying to reconcile right now, right? Is like the Rust core, it's not easy. Like it's easy when it's iOS, right? You just go, hey, compile this, and then link it, as like C headers and everything, right? No problem. It doesn't work like that when you have a TypeScript app, right? You can't just like pop this in there and go, hey, this is great. Like, so we're working on that, but that means there's a couple different ways. In general, kind of the main sync, strategy or architecture, whatever, and this is kind of, like I said, where my focus is We have this push-pull local sync strategy, right? We push our changes up. The server handles, validation and storing and all that stuff, all the complex, data storage that you have to have with large scale. And then it basically sends a ping to another service that I work on called the notifier. And the notifier, every 1Password app, each time you unlock an account, that account connects to the notifier. It basically says hey, I'm online. And then the notifier, whenever it gets one of these changes from the server, will ping all the connected clients that need to know about this change via this WebSocket connection. And then you'll trigger one of those sync jobs again. And so you can actually, you can imagine, right, with a company that's got, let's say, 10,000 people that may all be signed into the same account, you can have a lot of edits that are going out at the same time. So there can be a lot of pings going out. So there's some cool, like debouncing stuff that we do on the notifier side, which is just kind of a microservice. And then, we do some debouncing stuff even on the client side, right? Because you might be getting multiple of these pings for different reasons. So we'll actually in-queue different sync jobs that need to run kind of once it's their turn. But that's the main sync flow is the notifier will get a ping from the server saying, hey, something changed. It will let the device know with a ping, and the device queues up one of those sync jobs, which is just that push mechanism that we talked about. There's some nuance when it comes to a few other things, for example, like the extension. So autofill, from the extension can work a little bit differently because it's kind of got its own database in a way that does like KAnon stuff because it, for autofill, we may need to know that something is there is a password for this, but you may not necessarily be unlocked. So the actual data is not decrypted at the moment because everything is stored locally encrypted as well. It only decrypts while the account is unlocked and then gets re-encrypted. So which just syncing key sets for that can be its own little fun area of sync. But yeah, so something like autofill has to have its own little table for KAnon stuff so that it knows, hey, I've got something for this, but if you're going to actually use it, we need to go unlock or something like that. So there's a little bit of different syncing that goes on there, like the example you mentioned where it's like, hey, I added a domain and my extension knows about this now. There's some rebuilding of that table that's got to go on and so forth. And then there's some connection that the browser extension can have with an unlocked desktop app, for example. So there may be some different syncing that goes on with that.
It's crazy because you don't necessarily think about, there's all these little intricacies that you don't think about. Like you mentioned, you have to know if the site knows if it has a password. But even as far as getting into the WebSocket, the syncing conflict resolution, it's so funny because it feels like these problems show up in all these places you might not expect. You think about real time and syncing, oh yeah, you're building a chat app, but no, it's a 1Password. It's a password manager. Man, that's so cool. Wow.
Yeah, we do these internal hackathons. So I think it's quarterly or something like that. A couple times a year, we'll do these hackathons and they'll just give us a theme that's all right, this time it's, accessibility, or this time it's, impact and efficiency or something like that. Right. And we'll go into this notion and throw some ideas in there, and then everyone will just join teams and we'll just build anything for 3 days, whatever we feel like. It doesn't matter if it's got any commercial viability whatsoever. But because we have some of these things in place, someone actually built 1Password IRC as their hackathon project. I think they actually posted on LinkedIn a video of it or something like that, but they made 1Password into an IRC client. Wow. It was pretty cool.
That's great. So with 1Password using Rust, what's the benefit there?
Yeah, we get a few things out of it, right? So the first one being, the cross-platform nature of what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to embed this core in different places so we can just compile this to different targets that, come with the language and everything. And it's pretty easy that way. That's one of the nice things. The second nice thing that we get out of it is just the safety, right? Obviously, everyone always talks about memory safety with Rust, and that's pretty critical for us. It comes down to even things like zeroization. So when we deal with memories, like I mentioned, right, we decrypt the database when you unlock so that you have this data available. But when we're done, if something's been loaded into memory, we can't just forget about it like you kind of normally do with most languages, right? We have to manually flip those back to zeros to make sure that memory doesn't sit around. So that way, if someone's, let's say someone's traveling internationally or something, right, and they get picked up at the border and they flash a device or something like that, we need to make sure those were already zeros. We can't have that just sitting there for someone to find later on. So, we have things like travel mode for that. But yeah, specifically being able to manually manage that memory so that we can flip everything back to zeros and make sure that we are covering all the possible bases is pretty critical for us.
Wow, I didn't even think of that. You have to think about not the passwords just being encrypted, but the password possibly still being in memory of the system. That is wild.
And then we obviously get, performance benefits, right? And that's not, that conversation can go on forever about what's best there. But the performance benefits we get, like I mentioned, just with sync, right? You might have sync jobs that are pulling down all kinds of data, trying to do conflict resolution. That's all happening in the background where you're still using the app, maybe, right? Like you may be doing other things. You may be trying to do a search. So we've got one thread that spins off that's doing your search, and then we've got another thread that's spun off handling this sync job. And, you maybe just decrypted or so. Like there's a lot of things that can go on, right? And so making sure that we have the ability to handle really a lot of complex information, calculating Watchtower scores, right? While you're trying to do, something in the background or something like that. It can definitely be a pretty performance heavy, application with all the stuff that we're trying to get done. So Rust definitely helps us there. And I'm sure there are other languages that could, match the performance different ways and so forth. But with those other benefits, it just makes it a really nice, abstraction over all the problems we're trying to solve.
Yeah. The Watchtower score, that's really interesting. So if you don't know, Watchtower will tell you if you are reusing any passwords or if your password's been involved in a compromised website, things like that. So that's being calculated on the app when I have it open.
I think I'm not on the Watchtower team, but I actually think it's being calculated every time you click on the Watchtower tab, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
Because that, that can change at any given time, right? And it can, because Watchtower is growing too, right? Like now it'll tell you, hey, this website supports passkeys and you're using a password still, or things like that. So there's all these things that, Watchtower extends to do. And then, in a business use case, it's even more powerful in a lot of ways, right? Because you're trying to manage, governance and things like that, right? And so, Watchtower is pretty powerful little section.
It's one of the best features of 1Password for sure. And even just now, I popped it open as you said that. One of the new things on here, developer credentials on disk. Check your local disk for developer credentials. Man, I never seen that. That looks brand new.
There's so many cool developer tools, and this is where I feel like I always feel kind of undereducated, I guess, even on our own developer offerings. But I got here, I'd been at 1Password for a little while, and finally it was like, I see everybody talking about these other things. Like I need to I don't really need the 1Password CLI tool, let's say. Like I don't really have any workflows where I use that, but I know it's cool. Like I've seen some stuff with it. But then it was like, we have this SSH agent. And so I finally was like, oh, maybe that's going to be complex. I don't know. And then I set it up. It literally took like 2-3 minutes to set it up. And I've never worried about SSH ever again. Like everything just pops up, asks my fingerprint, and I'm done. It's like, this is great.
That's awesome.
It's amazing.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's incredible. I highly recommend the SSH agent.
That's my number one. I hate that every single time I type in SSH. I'm like, oh shoot, which password is it? Where did it go? Oh no, yeah, I know it's a total mess. Wow,
that's especially when you have signed commits. Like we require signed commits even for like our open source repos and stuff like that. And so just having that all built in is amazing.
Oh, because I have used the 1password.env and I'm trying to move everything over to it because I'll explain what it is for everybody listening is, you have like a local dev and you make a .env file and you put your database connection strings in there and your API keys and all that stuff. And first of all, it's a pain in the ass to manage because it's just a text file. And second of all, you put it in your git ignore, but you probably also shouldn't just have those keys hanging around on your in a text file on your computer. So you can run the OP CLI command, and it will then inject the environmental variables into your into that instance, and then you can just go ahead and use them with process.env. whatever.
Oh, that's fun.
That's really cool. Man.
It's pretty awesome. They have a few things like that. We have and again, some I'm not particularly well versed. We have like a skim bridge that handles being the middleman in some of this identity management stuff. There's like the connect servers and secrets management and all this stuff. There's so many cool little tools where it's just these neat little additions to the core concept of managing passwords, right? That are, I talked to someone the other day who was like, I do all of my notes that they're journalists. They're like, I do all my notes in 1Password. Like all my storage is in there. And it was like, just because it's encrypted by default and you don't have to worry about any workflows or anything. It's just right there. They use the tag system heavily. There's just a lot of little obviously I'm biased. I'm work here, right? But like, there's a lot of neat little like use cases. And even one of the things, I had never used it until I got here. One of the first projects I worked on was our Apple Watch project for 1Password 8. Because when we first moved from 7 to 8, we didn't have the Watch app and people were sorely missing it. So we tried to get that out to people. And it was just interesting seeing all the different use cases where people were like, oh, we have doors in our building that have a rotating code. And so now I have it on my watch, and it like shows me as one of my watch complications. So I can just, it's really easy. And it's just like, I would have never thought to use that, even being here. And it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, I put a lot of stuff in 1Password, from like driver's license to all of my kids' passports and stuff like that. I wonder personally, given I think there's some recent, not semi-recent, who is it? The other password one, LastPass, had some security issues. Yeah. Is that like given the nature of what you work on, are you ever concerned about the intense security in which everything exists under?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, right? Because it's funny, like people would talk to me and they were like, oh, that must be great for you guys. It's like, not really, to be honest, because I think most of us in this space tend to think of it as like people are using a password manager or they're not. And most people aren't, right? Like, so we kind of all, I think, still see this space as being a bit in its infancy. Like, it's at that phase where we're still trying to convince people, like, you should be doing this. And so, like, you'll hear, I mean, I think even Jeff Scheiner, our CEO, at one point was like, just use one. I would love it if it's us, but use one, please. Like, and so there's this, like, consensus that it's like, what happened with LastPass was unfortunate. But I think everyone in security tends to operate on the standpoint that, like, breaches aren't an if, but a when. Right? Like, the way things work now, like, there's so many crazy things that can happen. You see these people that spend so much money on it and it still happens. And it's like, there's always something. So that's why, like I mentioned with the sync system, like, everything on our side, even our metadata, which is what would kind of protect us in the LastPass scenario, our metadata is even encrypted on the server side. So, like, again, there's like some version numbers and stuff. But, like, something like autofill, like, we don't store, there's no URLs on the server. So if you get into our server and you get into somebody's account, you're not going to find anything really all that useful. You're going to know maybe how many times they've edited a vault, I guess would be the most useful info, but that's pretty limited, right? Like, so it's definitely something we think about a lot. And it's something, I mentioned, right, like zeroization, like the threat model that we're trying to work within, it's, I think, like, when I think about 1Password for the most part, right, it's like, oh, it's my Netflix. Like, if someone gets my Netflix, like, it's not a huge deal. It's unfortunate, but whatever, right? But there are a lot of people who are using this for, like, critical scenarios, businesses that are using this for things, people's bank accounts, like you said, passports or driver's license. Like, there are a lot of really intense situations that come up with this. And it's something where I think we do have to kind of balance it, like, from a, almost like a mental health standpoint, I guess, of like, you have to balance the intensity of what you're working on and the sort of, knowing that we can't really afford for mistakes. It's just not something that we can have. And we try and build that in mechanically as much as possible, but also balancing that with, like, you can't operate under that 8 hours a day for that many years, like, that's a lot of weight, in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, I guess that's a bit of a ramble, but to your original question, like, it's something that I think is front of mind. But also we try to just move that to a mechanic as much as possible. For example, like, we, in 1Password's app, you can't log dynamic strings by default. It's all blocked. So everything is built in mechanically so that, like, I can't go, X equals 7 and then print X. It'll be like, nope, can't do that. So we actually have a macro that allows us to log things, but everything that we want to log that's dynamic has to implement the specific trait that we have that makes it loggable. And anytime you want to add loggable to something, security developers are going to come in and review that. We have some scenarios where you can, like, make some assertions, but again, if you use that, security developer is going to come in and review that. So, like, there's just a lot of stuff that we try and bake right in that makes sure that mistakes are really hard to make. It's really hard to, like, slide stuff by. And it's, easier and harder depending on where you're at in the stack.
Yeah.
Closer you are to the client, you kind of have more layers of abstraction to the point where something would happen. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that's all over the place. And we definitely lean more on security than productivity. Like we probably slow ourselves down significantly in a lot of ways, trying to make sure that we don't break things. We go through very long nightly and beta processes before a release really goes out or even tries to be cut, to make sure that we have really deep QA testing that's gone on the back of our deep CI pipelines. That's gone on the back of all these mechanics. And so, yeah, it's definitely a huge part of what we do.
That's wild. What's the onboarding security training look like at 1Password? Because we have to do it every couple of months at Sentry, and it's like, don't plug USB sticks that you found on the ground into your computer, and you have to take a quiz about what should you do if you find a USB stick? Plug it in your computer. What does that look like at 1Password? I assume it's massive.
So honestly, I think it's probably not as intense as you might assume. One, because there are so many mechanics built in, right?
Yeah, the systems is better than trying to tell people, don't do this.
But there is a lot of, education that's got to go on, right? We call it 1Password University. I think it's actually got public facing component too. But there's employees can log in there, and there's all kinds of training that we do during onboarding, and that's not just security stuff, right? There's human resources things and so forth. And then we try to kind of slow play people into whatever they're doing here, so that there's a lot of kind of onboarding buddy type system to make sure, even just we brought in someone recently who's a senior Rust developer who hired in, and it was somebody who knows Rust very well. But when they get into the core, it's oh, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of domain knowledge, and why did we build things the way that we did and so forth. And then you get into, something like 1Password's been around since, I think it was 2005 or something like that. We're coming on 20 years here. There's a lot of historical decisions that are still around, as it tends to happen with anything you build. And so there's just so much context to everything you're doing. So security training kind of gets baked in throughout. But we also have, 1Password recently acquired Collide, which is a tool that runs on the local system, and it checks things for you, right? Are you following basically the company policy for device security to make sure that, hey, you don't have a sleep timer set, you need to update that. Or, hey, you have an old version of Chrome that's vulnerable, you need to make sure you update that. So we have a lot of those things, again, where we try to bake in, you always hear that phrase, right? Pit of success. You should always make the right thing, the easy thing. And so we've tried to lean into that as much as possible, right? Where it's let's just make the normal way the way that's already secure, and then we're good, and we'll try to teach people these concepts as well. But it's definitely baked in pretty heavily.
Cool. Let's talk about the WASM stuff. I know you're starting to dip into what this is, and obviously you want to run Rust anywhere. The web is going to be one of those places, or is already one of those places.
I believe is in beta. For our web app. I don't have any dates necessarily. I think it's still TBD on some of the more official releases and so forth, or stable releases. But yeah, that is the idea, right? So we've kind of had these client apps, which is the category of apps that run on top of the embedded Rust core, and then the web, right? It's kind of like this other thing, and it's kind of always. But because of that, you do that for years, and then you end up with a lot of these things that are really similar logic, but they're forked a little bit. And it's just enough that it's hard to bring them back in. And so we've been looking at that a lot. There's a team that's been working on that. And we've been consulting somewhat on that, just trying to help keep an eye on all the pieces, right? Because there's so much going on, and trying to figure out for example, the way that our app worked historically was from a code structure standpoint is there's this app that kind of represents the backend on the Rust side. Or this crate, that represents the backend on the Rust side. And so it's got this enum of all the invocations you can make. What are all the requests you can make, and their types and so forth. And that allows us, you may have seen we have a tool called TypeShare that we open sourced, that basically you can annotate any Rust struct with TypeShare, and it will spit out the TypeScript equivalent, or, whatever it is. So that's how we share types back and forth. But anyway, so we have this big backend crate or file really. But that means that when you compile this, if you compile that file, you compile everything that file links to, right? Just the way that tree kind of spreads out. And so you end up compiling the whole universe if you want anything, right? And so we had to modify that. It was all right, let's pull some of these things out into reusable services, And then we'll have multiple app crates that actually represent the apps that are consuming these things. So that way, something like the browser app that doesn't necessarily need everything, especially as we move, piece by piece, it only does a couple things right now from the Rust core. So let's just link up, we'll make an app crate that just has the things that we need in this enum. So that way we're only compiling that code, and, the size becomes significantly more manageable at that point. And that comes into everything. You got to make decisions, right? Like, so our core runs heavily on Tokio, the async runtime, and that's how we handle all of our futures and things like that. But it doesn't line up really one-to-one with WASM at the moment. It's a little bit tricky. And so we were building something the other day where it was like, do we have a scenario where we need a future, right? But do we sort of take a smaller crate like futures RS? Or do we just hand roll a little future? And it's like, well, hand rolling your own future is kind of complex. It's not something you'd usually want to do. But if it can avoid, 14 kilobytes or kilobytes or whatever they are, like, is that worth it? It's like, I've just never really operated in such a size constrained, area. And so it's like, I have to go in and be like, I don't know, does it? I've really no guidance whatsoever. I have no idea. Is that a lot in WASM? And it's like, some people are like, yeah, it's a lot. And it's like, well, how big is the binary? And it's like, well, it depends. And we're working on this and trying to get it smaller. And so size just becomes so much more constrained. Whereas like in our, space historically working on the core, it's been much more about resource constraints, or are we draining battery with syncs, or like, Apple, when we first built Apple Watch, it was like, we could do it like this would be really efficient, but it's constantly pinging. And so the battery just disappears. And so I was like, yeah, that's not going to work. And so, size is just not really the constraint that I've operated within. So WASM's been a whole new interesting area for that.
Ah, interesting. So Tokio is the runtime for writing asynchronous code, like imagine JavaScript async await, but in Rust, and that's what you call features, right?
Yes. So Tokio is sort of the de facto crate. There is something called async stood in Rust. Okay. I think that's the standard library one or something, but I've never really seen it used that much. Tokio is kind of like the main player in that space.
Yeah, that's what Dino is built on, right?
I think so, yeah. It's kind of a collection of really cool stuff. So Tokio has Tokio, which involves, runtime and some methods like spawning on this runtime and so forth. It also has some other pieces, right? Like there's, I think it's called Mio, which is like their actual like I/O implementation that handles async I/O from the operating system level. And then there's Tower, which is basically defines this service trait. And then you've got Axum, which is like a web server thing, which Axum is kind of cool because Axum is this really thin layer that basically lets you define middleware as long as that middleware implements this Tower service trait. Mm-hmm. You can build anything you want or use anyone else's. And so it ends up being this really interesting combination of little crates that come together to build a whole sort of async or concurrency ecosystem. It's really powerful. There's a ton of really interesting stuff. And just like I said, coming from my background with, web, where it's like, hey, you have a main function or you have, whatever it is, right? Well, with the embedded backend, my first thing when I got here was like, how does this run? Like, how does it know to wait for a request, right? Like, it's one thing, like, it always made sense to me, like, oh, I have this add function. You give it 2 integers and it spits one back out. It's like, well, that's just compiled and it's waiting for you to call it. But this thing has, like, listeners in the background. There's all this stuff going on. It's like, how does it know to, like, how does it stay running? And Tokio is actually kind of the mechanism for that. So that watching for those invocations, we basically block particular, like we spin up a thread and then we block that thread watching a channel. And every time something comes in on that channel, we process it and it spawns its own tasks and so forth. But then we hand that channel off to the main app, and the main app, basically processes these things as they come in, and we hand off the sender of all that to the FFI. So then whenever they call invoke over this FFI, it puts something into that channel and it goes to the whole mechanics. But it's really kind of like it's a really interesting way to, run this embedded backend sort of thing that we have in there. It's pretty neat.
Wow. Oh. Yeah. I'm building like a video app in Tori with Rust. And the moment I installed Tokio was the moment I was like, all right, I guess I'm getting into Rust here.
No kidding.
This is the spot. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. So in your app, Scott, what are you using it for? At what point did you realize you needed that?
Yeah. So accepting various streams of blobs of video and then writing them to files. Yeah, that was pretty much it. It was,
okay.
I have multiple streams coming in and being able to write them to files. Yeah.
And that's super interesting. And I should say really quickly, Andrew said FFI. That means foreign function interface. That means calling a Rust function from somewhere else. Am I right about that?
Yeah. So you have to basically, we have this Rust app. We're trying to embed it, let's say, in an iOS app. But we need a way for Swift to know how to call that function. And the FFI is where you define, basically, they call it the calling convention. So over this function, I might say, like, this is an extern function that's going to have the C calling convention. And that's going to tell the actual, basically, how you actually organize this memory. It needs to have so many bytes for the name and so many bytes for the argument, so many bytes for this, right? And that's kind of how it lines up all those things.
So how is this all connected to the UI here? So you're shipping an app. What's the UI built in? Is that built in web tech and then connected
for the browser side? Yes. Yeah. So each app we try and have, as native as possible, basically. Okay. So the browser app, it's a React app that, and this is actually kind of interesting. This is a new area for us as we migrate. We need to make sure that this app has certain amounts of data, and there's some identifying challenges that can come, crossing that boundary from the client app into the core. So we actually have a Redux store on the client side. And then one of the guys on that team built basically a bridge crate in the core that gets all the Redux selectors and can pull stuff back into the core from the Redux side. And then we have some kind of a sync process that goes on from the core side into that Redux store to make sure that the Redux store is constantly updated. But it's interesting, like I said, because you go into WASM and it's it doesn't really sort of support the multi-threading in the way that we're used to. I know WASM has worker threads or whatever they're called, but it doesn't quite work the same way that the other ones do. And so it's a really cool mechanic. Again, it's sort of probably a temporary mechanic as we shift it to be more and more of just using the normal core as we get there. But it's a really cool way to sort of federate that data back and forth.
Wow, man. That's wild. You think you know a thing or two about software development, hitting an API and saving variables, putting the variables in a div, and then you talk to people, and it's just there are so many different problems out there that are being tackled in all these different ways. It's just fascinating to hear.
I make button with CSS. I feel like I came that.
You know what's funny though is doing all this stuff, I still couldn't put a button where it needs to go to save my life. And I was a front end developer for years, and I couldn't touch CSS. If I was working on a Vue app and we used Vuetify, and the designer sent over design, I literally sent back sorry, that button doesn't exist in Vuetify. You're going to have to pick one of these options. And I sent them the link to the Vuetify docs where it was you get extra large, or medium.
Yeah, this
is sorry, these are your options. I don't know what to tell you.
That's so funny.
Oh, man. And how did you pick up Rust then if you have a JavaScript background?
I was doing, like I said, server-side stuff. But I knew I kind of wanted to... I don't know, it almost sounds arrogant, I guess, step up into kind of another level of engineering stuff, right? I'd worked at a marketing agency and an ad agency and a health tech company and stuff like that, but it was all kind of smaller stuff, So I wanted to jump into something that was way more intense, knew it was gonna push me. And so they had an opening for a Rust developer. And so I got through the first couple rounds or whatever, and then I get to the technical interview. And I went in to this interview. It was actually with two guys that I still work with, Ivan and Mathieu. And they pull up this playground, Rust playground with some code in it. And they're like, all right, just walk us through this. And I'm walking them through, a few minutes in, Mathieu is one of the nicest people ever. He stops me. He's like, I'm just going to ask, have you ever done Rust before? And I was like, I've never written a line of it in my life. This is my first time right here. And he was like, okay, that's fine. That's good context. Now we know, so basically they gave me 2 or 3 pointers. I walked through what was going on and they were like, that was pretty good. Considering you didn't know it or whatever. So they eventually hired me, obviously, and I get here and my boss is like, considering your background, we're going to give you a couple months to just figure this out. And I was like, oh. So they really, I think I got 3 months of basically just learn, play around with stuff. If you want to try and tackle tickets, do it, but don't even worry about if they ever merge, just figure it out. And so I got a couple books, and John Yangzit is a guy who does YouTube stuff for Rust. I highly recommend. Extremely, extremely useful stuff. He goes everywhere from like some of kind of like the mid-level Rust learning stuff all the way into, he does a series called Decrusting, where he'll go into some like Axum, for example. So he'll go into Axum and he'll be like, all right, we're going to go all the way to the bottom. Like we're going to dig through the source code of Axum, and I'll explain to you how every piece works. It was really awesome. I mean, to this day, I've been watching that stuff to really learn a ton. But going through him, there's another channel called Let's Get Rusty, a guy named Bogdan. And he kind of goes through the Rust book chapter by chapter and explains some of the concepts and shows examples. So it's really those two YouTube channels and a couple books and stuff like that. We actually have a Rust study group at 1Password too. That didn't really start until after I had got here. There's a guy, Tanner Gill, one of the developers here, started a Rust study group. And so I jumped into there, and that helped me a ton. Honestly, it was immensely helpful because there's a lot of really elite Rust people here. Like one of the Tokio maintainers works here. There's a few other big crates that are maintained by people here. Just a lot of knowledge. And so it was massive to getting me, where I am now. I actually ended up taking over the Rust study group for this iteration, and just trying to kind of give back on that one, because I think we have like 130 people in there. And it's everywhere from like developers of other languages to like CX people. I think we have an account manager type person, and like there's all kinds of stuff. We're trying to.
How many people work at 1Password?
There's over 1,000.
I could build it in a weekend.
Wow. Yeah,
right, yeah. It's it's so funny because like you said, it's so funny when you look at it on the surface and you're like, it's password manager, right? Like, there's other ones around, and then when you get into it and you're like, again, there's an entire team for security engineering and a separate team for security development, and then you've got, everybody that's got to handle all the data federation, which is again, kind of how I refer to our team. And then, you've got some people that are handling item management, another team that's handling onboarding and activation stuff. There's another team that has to handle observability and experimentation, and a team that's got to do all of our UI components. We have like our own internal library of components. Like, so there's all these people. And then you look at the depth of the features that exist now between things like Watchtower, but things like the CLI tool, things like our open source crates, things like we have a team that does platform advancement, which basically just means this is a team that knows all the actual platform mechanics inside and out. So there's a guy over there, Neil, that just does Windows stuff, and he just knows how Windows, like the quirks of Windows inside and out. And so when we have these weird networking thing that only pops up on Windows, Neil knows how to fix it, and there's just so much kind of surprising nuance, I guess, when it comes to making something like this, and more importantly, making it, efficient, useful, and safe.
Wow.
I always wondered that, like how many people are working there, because even like my bank's mobile app did something where the 1Password was no longer prompting, like they changed the input type or something weird like that on the iOS app. And I tweeted at them, and they're like, "Hell, have you tried uninstalling and reinstalling it?" And I was like, "No, that's not the problem." I was like, "Thank you, you're no help." So then I pinged 1Password, and I'm pretty sure they literally walked over there and kicked some butt.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure, like, is that a team in there as well? Like contacting people who run apps and say like, "Hey, 1Password broke on your app or is no longer being prompting."
I would guess that someone does that. I mean, we have a team that does filling and saving specifically. So that there's a team that is specifically focused on filling and saving across all the different platforms and so forth. And I've just like, again, that area, they end up dealing a lot with web stuff, which is where my mind always just gets blown by like, again, they talk about things like focus traps, right? Where like there'll be scenarios where like you'll, click on the thing and then it pops the pop-up back up again, even though it's already got it there. Or you click it and it doesn't actually fill in. And they're like, well, here's all these scenarios where the website developer can actually completely block us from being able to do anything from the extension. And it's like, oh my gosh. Like, and then of course, like to a user, it's like 1Password's not working because that's what it looks like, like there's no, how would they know, And so it's like, we have all these areas where it's like being internal to a company like this, it just makes you, whenever you see stuff on Reddit, you're always like, we're fixing that. Oh, we're fixing it. It's like, or like, we're trying, I swear. It's a challenge though. I mean, the web is so hard. It's like, when I look at Rust stuff, people will say like Rust's complicated. I've been saying this a lot this week because I had to fix how we registered a service worker to register the browser for push notifications. And I haven't touched TypeScript in years. I've never done service workers. And so I was working with one of our TypeScript devs, getting in there, and you're just like, oh, you can't do that. So this blew my mind. Maybe you already know this. I was having issues with the registration because then I would try and do something and we would get an error and it would be like, oh, there is no service worker registered. But if I waited a second, it worked. And so I looked at the docs and it says like, this was like the, MDN docs or whatever. And it was like the service worker dot register function returns a promise that fulfills as soon as it's clear that it's valid JavaScript. Resolving this promise has nothing to do with whether or not the service worker has registered. So it's like the register function's promise doesn't actually tell you whether or not it registered, which blew my mind. And so I kept messaging them like, they say Rust is hard, like the web is tough. Like there's so much. And I feel like front end devs kind of get like shade in general for like, oh, it's not, systems programming. It's not kernel development, right? Or whatever, right? Like it's kind of seen in a lot of ways as like this like lesser area. But then you see all this stuff and you're like, oh no, when I write Rust stuff, it just works. Like it's tough to get it there sometimes, but then it just works. And it's not that way on the web.
Yeah, the red squiggles in Rust will make me pull my hair out, but they make your app work. Yeah.
Not to mention the fact that 1Password has to work on every single app ever. Like 1Password was throwing a console error in Chrome, and like people had pitchforks out for like a week while it was being fixed. And I'm sure there's a process to get that done, but like running code on everybody's website, and you have to take into account. I would love to see like I'm sure there's like a hacks.js file for like common websites that just fix it. I remember I had friends that used to work at Opera, and Opera had a major part of their browser engine was just hacking like Bank of America to work with Opera, like just fixing the web.
I know like we have a Linux app. And the Linux app requires a lot of love to make sure, you've got all these different like desktop environments, and, you got Wayland, and Wayland's got all these little, quirks that are still getting figured out. And so like Linux takes a lot of love. The browser extension, obviously, has a bunch of weird quirks. Like that was one of the things that was hard for me, like trying to take over the sync concept. Is it was like, oh, we can rebuild it this way. And they're like, nah, you can't do that. And it was like, why? And they're like, well, because the browser can kill the service worker like whenever it wants. And it was like, wait, what? And they're like, yeah, you really don't know like when that's going to happen. And I was just like blown away. I was like, oh, so you have to basically always assume that this thing may or may not ever be running. And it's like, yeah, pretty much.
We just recorded a show on the cache API, and Scott was saying like, you can't know that it's going to be there. You can hope.
Hope is the best that you get with the web, I think, in a lot of cases. It's such a unique, because obviously like it moves so fast, whereas like operating systems, where you're looking at like, again, like the Rust mechanics. So I'm making a binary for, a Mac, right? Like it doesn't change that fast to where the code breaks, but the web can. Like the browsers update all the time. There's always little things that can go wrong. And so it's just a whole other like universe working in something that's that, dynamic and changing. I was working at a couple companies ago where we would build something, and this was people who had worked in software in like the 80s and like business side people. And they were doing this and they were just like, why are we still working on this thing? And it was like, well, the API changed. I'm like, why are we using the new one? I'm like, well, you don't really get a choice. Like, it's not like you can't just like build it and let it go. Like, they were like, oh, well, the company we worked at, their stuff still works, and they haven't had developers in 30 years. It was like, well, yeah, it's written in COBOL, and it's running on a computer they have to keep in a, hermetically sealed box.
Yeah, like you can't reboot it.
Yeah, exactly. If it ever turns off. I worked with a company where it was like that too, where they had an AWS instance, and it was like, the name was like, do not turn off There Be Dragons or something like that. And it was like, they had some identity management thing that like you couldn't deploy if this thing had ever been turned off because it would delete some cache that it needed. It was wild.
Oh man. Terrifying. We have a couple of shows every year on horror stories like that. Actually, you must know you have a syntax basketball in the background.
I do, yeah. I almost sent one in, Wes, I'd sent it to you. My horror story, actually, Scott, you were slightly involved.
Oh, no.
So not in a bad way. I worked for this company. This was years and years ago. It was like my first real dev job. And it was a like ad agency, a marketing company. And they took on this website. So we had a team of like 60 people in Vietnam. And they were awesome. They crushed it. We took on this project and they made this really cool design. It was a WordPress site, but it had like these triangle cutouts on the sides that would be transparent through to the back. But it also was a template. So you had to make these templates where the triangles would match up when you like did a page builder type thing. So they could build their own custom pages. So the CSS was wild. And after we took on the project, they were like, oh, US citizens only. That's the only people that can work on this. We can't have foreign contractors. And so we were like, oh no. And so there was literally one front end dev and me, the back end dev. And it was like, oh, I don't know what we're going to do. So I talked to my boss like day 2, and the front end dev was really more of like a designer. Like she had a graphic design background. She's really incredible with design. But like the project structure was a little tougher for her. Like at the time, I think it was like Gulp. This was like 2017 maybe. But it was like Gulp and stuff. Like she didn't really know much about that stuff. So she was kind of just writing raw CSS. And so I emailed Scott and I was like, my entire exposure to development as a community was this podcast and Wes's courses. That was all I had at that point. I didn't know a single other person in the world that did this. So I literally emailed Scott and I was like, hey, this might be dumb. I don't even know, like you might be famous. This might be weird, right? Like, I don't know what's going on, but we have a project that kind of has like a blank check. Like, could you come in and do this? You were super nice about it. You responded. You're like, hey man, no worries at all. Like, I'm pretty busy right now. My buddy Eric can tackle this, no problem.
Oh yeah. Did Eric end up doing that for you?
He did. Yeah. I ended up working with him on a few different things over time. And then I ran into him. I ran into him, I think twice at the airport over the next couple of months, like just all over the place. But yeah, it was wild.
He's a wild man. He's everywhere. Wes, this is Eric Sartorius, who is the digital nomad we had on the show. He has currently moved to an island off of Portugal and is currently living there. I think he bought some land in Portugal. Right. Yeah.
The last time I talked to him, he's buying a house in Phoenix or something like that. And then
he did. Yes. Now he's living in Portugal. So
yeah, it was wild, man. It was crazy though. He came in and crushed that project because we had to they also had a blog in HubSpot or something. And so we had to duplicate the same website design to HubSpot. And so we had to figure out how to make those modules exist over there and do all the CSS. And Eric was a lifesaver. Wow. The 3 of us had to knock out this project in 8 weeks or something. And it was huge. It was crazy. We were staying up till midnight every night. It was wild.
That's glad to hear. If you want to hear about Eric's his digital nomad trips where he's traveling everywhere, it's episode number 586. We'll make sure we have a link for that in the show notes.
Yeah, he was telling me wherever he moves somewhere, he just buys exercise equipment and that's his whole apartment. It's just
I have one of his kettlebells in my house because he was like, I'm moving. I cannot take a kettlebell with me to Germany or something. I was like, all right, I'll take your kettlebell. Yeah. That's so funny. Okay, well, I think we're getting up kind of tight here. So, is there anything that we did not cover that you wanted to make sure we hit on?
No, not necessarily. I think we pretty much covered kind of the gist of it.
Nice. What about sick picks and shameless plugs? Did you come with a sick pick or shameless plug?
Yes. So I have a very pertinent sick pick, which is the Nix Mini 3 color. I think it's called color selector or something like that, or color finder. So it's this little Bluetooth device. You hook it up to your phone, and then it's got a camera on the backside, and you hold it up to any surface, and it'll give you all the color codes. And even the brand names, Sherwin-Williams calls it this and blah, blah, blah. So our HOA just told us we have to repaint our house for the 10-year paint or whatever. And so I literally just went outside and stuck this on every surface, made a whole map and sent it over to the paint people. And they were like, no problem, done. And now my neighbors all the same thing, apparently. So
that's incredible.
That's cool.
You can map your whole house even. It'll let you store the colors you scan with names and sections and all this stuff. So I have our whole house mapped out now, office, wall, office trim, everything. It's amazing.
That is so cool.
Can you go to bm.westboss.com? Because one of my projects is I converted all the Benjamin Moore paint colors to CSS variables.
And of course you named it BM. That's so funny.
Check out BM. I'm curious if you tap it on your screen, if it would actually match it close enough, or do you if you have to pull out your phone?
Oh yeah, screen would be tough, Wes. Yeah,
screen because the screens are always different. Yeah,
but also that is interesting.
It's gonna find the pixels or yeah.
Yeah, and my monitor, my main monitor is actually a really cheap one, so I would guess that it's not very color accurate.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to find that. I'll let you know. I'll reach out to you and let you know if it works.
This
Always
is so
curious
cool.
about that because we have all the books from Benjamin
Oh,
Moore,
yeah.
Sherwin Williams. What's the one from Restoration Hardware has his own paint company as well. So we have all the books you can just page through, and I love looking at those. So many cool colors.
I think we need to be way better about it because just especially this year, like so I live in Denver, and like the hail and stuff like that just like chips away paint and all this. So like our like front porch, we have like, poles where the walkway is and stuff like that. And there's so many little like scuffs and chips and stuff like that. So I need to, I think, just be better about paint in general. But this thing has been a little lifesaver for sure, just with even like textiles and stuff like that. Cause like you can, use it for like color wheels. So when we were trying to figure out, we bought a couch and had a bad experience because we thought it was gray and it was definitely like a sage green. But it was just, again, the way it looked on the website on our computer. And so now we've been really careful about like, all right, let's check what actual color this is. And then we'll go check the other color. So that way you're not like, you don't have to bring things with you, but also you don't have to like guess from home. Like, yeah, I feel like it's that gray, or is it lighter? Is it darker? Like my wife and I will definitely have that conversation.
Man, this is a great housewarming gift. It's like $100.
Yes.
I think.
Yes. Yeah.
That's such a good housewarming gift.
Yeah.
Imagine, because you're going to paint your whole house anyway.
Right.
Oh,
Andrew, this
good.
has just
Can I tell
unlocked
you
something I had no idea existed. And I'm totally like, wow, this is amazing. No idea this existed before this. Yeah.
It's so cool. This was our first house. We'd had apartments our whole lives. And for the most part, I grew up in apartments, stuff like that. And so when we moved in here, it was like, oh my gosh, we can do so much. We can put a fireplace over there and we can do this. Like I had all these ideas and I did nothing. But I did buy the thing to figure out the paint for when I do start doing all these things.
Yeah.
Eventually.
Yeah. Well, we got to grab coffee sometime, Andrew, if you're around.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm not going to reveal my location on the podcast. We'll talk later. Shameless plugs. Anything you would like to plug?
I'll give it to you for $5.
Yeah, shameless plugs. I mean, like I said, use a password manager. That's probably my biggest one. I don't know how shameless that is, since it's not necessarily. I would obviously prefer people use 1Password, but definitely use one. It's huge. The other one, I guess, maybe. Oh, this would be more of a sick pick, I suppose. There's a book though called Asynchronous Programming in Rust by Carl Frederick Sampson, and it's all the examples are in Rust, but it's really much more about like how async works literally down to the electrical signals. And it's amazing. It's huge. It's really definitely made me feel like I gained a whole nother level in my understanding of what's really going on. So that's probably another sick pick. But yeah, shameless plug. Then it's just 1Password. Use it.
Cool.
Check out.
I really
all the cool
admire
stuff
the
it
Rust
does.
community for doing these types of these books online that are all using the same template. I don't know what that is, but it's a lot of them do it. It's great.
Yeah. Yep.
Word. Cool. Well, thank
Awesome.
you so much, Andrew. This has been awesome. It's been really eye-opening, honestly. So
Yeah, really cool.
yeah. Wow.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on.
For sure.
Oh, you're welcome. All right. Peace.
Later.